This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Do my very best. So hello everybody. So Nina already told all the story I was going to tell you. So what I want to talk about here is one of several issues. I'm going to focus on one of several ethical issues that are being actualized by the phenomenon of antibiotic resistance. But I will do that in a way, so I will also sort of introduce a little bit what antibiotic resistance or drug resistance more generally is. So you have all these terms in this area. So most of you have probably heard about antibiotic resistance, right? Or antibiotic resistance. There's also this antimicrobial resistance. It's a hopeless term that the World Health Organization uses. What that is meant to mean that every drug that you use to target some kind of pathogen, some kind of microorganism that can harm human health, a virus, a fungus, or whatever, can for every such drug there can be resistance developed. But the most common kind of resistance, and at this moment in time the most serious one, is antibiotic resistance. So often when we talk about drug resistance, what we mean in practice is resistance to antibiotics. And when we talk about this, is of course that these microorganisms, the bacteria, are becoming resistant to the drugs. It's not that people become resistant to the drugs or anything like that. So that's just a little bit of introduction in that way. I will talk a little bit about the technical side of that. I'm not in medicine, I'm neither in public health, I'm a philosopher, but I've worked a lot with applied issues. I'm also stealing a little bit of knowledge from my more knowledgeable people in this center that I'm part of. But then I'm going to focus more specifically on the relationship between how antibiotic resistance may reshape the conditions of healthcare and health systems more generally, and how that sort of relates to standard ideas that we have in medical ethics on how to behave responsibly as a doctor or as a nurse or as another kind of health professional in medical ethics. That's going to be my talk, and then I'm going to problematize it a little bit and speak a little bit at the end about how you might resolve these dilemmas that seem to pop up. So you have what you could do to fight the antibiotic resistance challenge or threat, if you want, and at the same time you want to respect sort of standard rules of medical ethics. Could you do that at the same time? I'm not sure, but I will talk a little bit about it. So, and if any of you have sort of a more specific question, more clarificatory question, just wave your hand and I'll try to answer it, something you don't get or something. But afterwards we will have plenty of time for a Q&A afterwards. So here's to start with and to talk about drug resistance then. So it's a rapidly increasing and spreading phenomenon. So both in that more and more types of bacteria are becoming resistant to more and more types of antibiotics. So last year we had the first reported instances of what we call last resort antibiotics. So this is the antibiotics that you use when you tried all the other kinds and they don't work because the bacteria is resistant towards them. This is the one you go for, often called carbapenems. So you had the first reported instance of resistance to that kind last year in China, but it's spreading very quickly. So antibiotic resistance bacteria strains are spreading as quickly as a plane ticket can take you around the world, because they are traveling with us, right? And they're traveling with our food and so on. So you can see it's very rapidly. At the same time, another aspect is that at the same time that you have the resistance developing very quickly and also around the world, you have a decline in the production of new antibiotic formulas. So, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So one thing that could help, so actually in all drug and pharmacological treatments, you have this constant race with nature because of evolution. And one way of winning the race is to keep finding out new formulas of drugs to keep ahead of the resistance development. But when you have the innovation on this side going down down while you have the curves going up, then you have this problem. And if you want to, you can go to the World Health Organization. They have a lot of good data on this. They just released a new report on the global surveillance here. So the global surveillance is still lacking. So it's only 25% of the world's countries that are now participating in the surveillance, but it's also increasing very quickly. At the end of the talk, you will find a lot of links that I will just leave up here for you to look at. Right, so if you look at it, so that's drug resistance. What's the drug resistance challenge? I think that the first people think about is this idea, so maybe you read the papers about the superbug that's going to kill us all. So this idea of an epidemic that we can't defend ourselves against. So that's the first that people think about, of course. So, and of course, our welfare societies and modern health systems, they rest on this backbone that we can control epidemics. So one of the backbones of modern civilized societies is that we have been able, with the help of sanitation, but also with the help of antibiotics and vaccination and education of people, to control infectious disease. So people are not getting so sick as they used to. They're getting much less sick, and when they get sick, we can treat them. And the problem is, of course, that we have a lot of people getting sick all the time. They can't go to work. You damage the economy. You damage all the sort of resources that you need to run a health system. The whole society sort of is falling apart. So that's why this is important, of course. But it's not only that. So that's one part of this challenge. The other part is this, that also if we think that we don't get any large epidemics, a lot of the things that we do in hospitals today depend on the fact that we have access to effective antibiotics. So almost all kinds of open surgery. I mean, open surgery would be 1,000 more times more dangerous than it is if we had no antibiotics. Because, of course, when you open up a body, the risk of infection is enormous immediately, even if you have good sanitation. And especially, of course, transplantation surgery, where we also make transplantation possible by killing or reducing the immune response system, then of course access to antibiotics become even more important, because you get more easily infected, and then you need to have drugs to treat the infections. Other part of the neonatal care or other types of care where you have patients who are extremely vulnerable and fragile, they don't have much of defenses of their own, so therefore being able to treat infections is they can't defend themselves, basically. And cancer care is another area where you give people these extremely potent chemicals that are supposed to fight the cancer, but it also fights a lot of other parts of the body at the same time, and for example the immune response system, so therefore it's extremely important to be able to treat infections. Otherwise this care won't work, basically. So it's not only these things with the epidemics, it's also that actually a lot of modern healthcare depends on access to effective antibiotics to be effective at all. At the same time then, you have this is very simple, that any kind of pathogen, virus, bacteria, will naturally develop resistance to any kind of threat that it encounters in nature. This is just ordinary evolution, it's nothing strange, it's quite natural. So this we can expect this. And then antibiotics become ineffective. But then you have this sort of, then you caught in this kind of conundrum then, well, okay, to have these well-functioning welfare societies and health systems, you need to use antibiotics, but the more we use antibiotics, the more we will stimulate the resistance development. Because the more antibiotics will be introduced into nature and create this evolutionary pressure that stimulates resistance development. So here's a basic dilemma of the challenge now. Right. So is everybody following that? Someone thinks that I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Okay, fine. Okay, so we move on. This is sort of as deep as my medical knowledge goes. If you want to ask technical questions, I'm not the person to answer those, actually. I'm just a philosopher. Okay, so what can we do about this then? Well, actually, this has been the reaction for quite a bit of a time. So let's pretend it's not there, right? I suppose all of you have felt ill sometimes. You've gone to a doctor and you said to the doctor, well, can't you give me something? The headache won't go away. I still have a fever. Can't you give me something? When we do that, we're these people, right? But you can do a lot of things, and in the center we're working on then how to do this. And one of the things you can do, of course, is to attack this innovation problem here, that the fact that you don't have new formulas of drugs being developed, and that's partly a technical, a scientific challenge, because it's difficult to find new, radically new formulas. Basically, most new formulas are sort of small variations of the old ones, and then resistance development is very quick. The wet dream here is, of course, to find a totally new way of killing off bacteria without killing off people, which is very difficult, actually. So for any drug, of course, the more effective it is against an infection, the higher the risk that the drug will also harm the patient. So this is basic kind of thing in medical research then. So part of it is technical scientific, but most of it is actually societal and economical, and maybe legal as well. So I will talk a little about that. Could we change societal systems, institutional setups around research and innovation then to have more new drug formulas coming into existence quicker? Another thing you could do is to then control consumption of antibiotics. This is often called antibiotic stewardship in English. So when you look at the WHO site, for example, you will have long sections on antibiotic stewardship. So this is and what you're talking about then is most of the time the use of antibiotics in healthcare or for healthcare purposes. So basically when doctors prescribe antibiotics or something like that. I will talk about more, but you could also have this thing also in, for example, in farming. So I think this is a big difference between Sweden and Germany. I think in Germany you're allowed to use antibiotics for growth purposes still in farming. In Sweden it's banned because of this. So this is, and so I learned just a few months back at this symposium we had that North America is on track or maybe banning it also for growth purposes. It will still be used, of course, because modern farming, especially industrial farming, produces a lot of infections, because you keep the animals very tightly together and so on. And therefore you will treat them with antibiotics anyway, so you will still have a lot of it. But you can, controlling consumption is of course one, because if we consume less antibiotics, then of course this evolutionary pressure to produce resistant bacteria is weakening. So you have a slower resistance development if we are more careful about when we consume antibiotics and when we don't. Then we can of course also try to control the spread of resistant infections. Now we talk about that as well, so you could more effectively survey or monitor where you have these resistant bacteria and who are being affected with it, and then you can take different kinds of well-known actions that you do when you fight infectious disease and epidemics. So if you have someone who is MRSA resistant carrier, for instance, in a hospital, you might want to take this person out of the hospital to reduce the risk to have this bacteria spreading to these more vulnerable people, for example, in the surgery part of the hospital, for instance. So that's a very simple example. We talk some about those actions as well. Then you have a fourth kind of action, which we work a lot with, but I won't talk about so much of this, but this has to do with it's been surfaced that there's a lot of the emission of drugs generally, but especially antibiotics, is done not in the consumption stage, but in the production stage. So from the actual factories that manufacture the drugs, they emit a lot. Much more than they wanted to admit. But now people have been measuring and so on, they have to admit, and I think most of the big pharma industry now sort of acknowledge, okay, so this is a problem, we need to sort of try to do something about that. But of course we also have strong business interests here, and everybody is sort of nervous of losing a competitive edge against the others and increased costs and so on. So it can be extremely complicated to find good policies that would be effective against this. It could be easy to say, well, why don't we just ban them and say that they can't emit the drugs? The problem is that they will probably just move to somewhere else, and as long as we don't have an effective global ban, that won't help us so much. So I won't talk about that because it doesn't. This is part of the problem, but it's not immediately enacted within healthcare, so it doesn't immediately relate to medical ethics, although it does relate to it in an indirect way. Okay, so from an ethical point, so one thing that ethicists love to point out are goal conflicts, value conflicts, and you will find a number here. So there are several goal conflicts here, internal ones, just between these things that we could do. So for example, if you want to speed up innovation, you wouldn't really like to control consumption. Because if you control consumptions for the drug company, it doesn't make sense to innovate a thing that will then not be consumed. So if you're a commercial company and want to develop something, you want it to be sold, right? And if you control consumption very tightly, then it's not a good idea to try to develop that product. So that's kind of a very simple little dilemma that you want to try to work with then. So can we sort of construct policies or institutional structures that could deal with that, and would those bring? Another one is, of course, between also 1 and 4 is another thing. So if you have effective ways of controlling drug emissions, these will probably then increase the cost of the production of the drug. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I'm not following for the potential goal conflict of 1 and 2, because if you keep the price up, then you can speed up innovation at a very low consumption.
Yes, but
it's just not economical, but this is an ethical dilemma, so there is no internal goal conflict.
Well, in the sense that you, but if you take the price, sure, but if you place the price up, the consumption goes down as well. So that's also simple economics.
No,
so
healthcare economics, because there you have an offer-induced demand. That's the fundamental basis of healthcare economics. So I agree that on a society point where someone has to pay the bill, you run into a dilemma, but it's not an internal, it's an external.
Okay, so I see. So your point is, okay, so here society could step in and fill in the financial gap somewhere. Okay, so of course, but then you have to make the choice that this is a normative important thing to do, and you have to have a voting population that are willing to support a tax increase or whatever you would have to do to pay for it. Sure. Okay, I agree. Another one between these two, for instance, is that if you have a lot of monitoring and surveillance mechanisms, you might scare people off from hospitals. They want to have any contact with this healthcare. They try to monitor them all the time and try to keep track of them. They rather buy their antibiotics online or something like that. So, and then at the end of the day, you have less control. So you have a lot of these sort of practical things that are difficult then to deal with. And a lot of the solutions that are sort of proposed in these areas in order to try to fix it are of the kind that you mentioned. They are different kinds of institutional, legal, political, or also moral solutions that you want to introduce some kind of normative structure that people accept, for instance. So I will talk a little bit about some of these, right? Right, so in relation to then traditional professional medical ethics, I'm going to talk about this. So when I'm talking about medical ethics now, I'm talking about the actual professional consensus that you have globally around the world. I'm not talking about moral philosophy. I'm talking about what doctors are sort of bound by the professional oath and institutions to. They are supposed to sort of keep to this. And there, of course, a lot of variation around different countries, how this play out practically in various ways, but there are a few things that sort of repeat themselves that have also been addressed in this context then. So one very obvious thing that you find both in this Declaration of Geneva and also in the research ethics is the focus on the individual patient. So that a health professional, a doctor or nurse should always act out of an interest for the best interest of your patient, basically. And so it's the medical individual need that should be in focus, and in later decades has come in more and more that not only should you care for their health, you should also respect them as persons, and for example don't force them to take treatments that they don't want to have or things like that. Another part is that at the same time you shouldn't be offering people just anything. You have a responsibility to ensure that what you offer within healthcare is good enough. So this is often talked about in terms of professional responsibility. So treatments need to be well motivated, mostly because they will always have risks, for instance. So you also want them to be effective and not too risky. In order to do that, you need to do research, and then comes this third part, the clinical research ethics part, where you basically have. So you say that in order to ensure this, we also need to do research. This means that we have to allow that we actually experiment a little bit with people, that we are testing new things that we are not so sure about at the beginning, whether or not it will be good. This is necessary. But when doing this, we should keep to norms that will still keep this patient focus. So we should still be very careful that we're not exploiting the individual patient, person, too much then. And this is of course found very clearly in the Declaration of Helsinki, expressed then. And then there's a very basic thing that is repeated in both of these and a lot of other kind of doctor's oaths and things like that. And it's this idea that you're saying that, okay, so of course these things can come into conflict with other kinds of considerations. Could be scientific considerations, could be monetary considerations, could be that the politicians want you to do something that you feel are in conflict with your professional duties, and then you should insist on your integrity. You shouldn't bend to that. You should keep to your ethics and don't bend to societal demands, for instance. And this is a very important part of professional medical ethics. When you talk to doctors, this is often what they hold up as the most important part here, that we're a profession, we're not here to serve society, we're here to serve our patients, basically. This is often what you say. Okay, so when I talk about medical ethics, this is what I'm thinking about. So let's look at the first sort of strategy that you could try to employ now then to respond to this antibiotic resistance challenge. Well, so what is being produced? So some things that are being proposed in this area is that all things are basically about that you want to create incentives for researchers and drug companies to more innovation, quicker, and so on, right? And some of these incentives could be discussed whether they are not effective or not. Of course, they could be about, creating prizes for new discoveries, or to offer financial reimbursement or support and so on. But a lot of the things that are being discussed is that is more of this kind, that you want to smooth the pathway from idea to product. So a lot of the costs are being created because when you develop a new drug, there are a lot of stages you have to go through, and there's a lot of control mechanisms in these processes. So from the sort of idea in the laboratory to a drug that's being sold on a market, it's a long way to that. And this way has a lot of red tape, so a lot of rules around how can you take idea to product, basically. So a lot of talk in this area has been about what Americans love to call cutting the red tape. So you want to relax regulation a little bit, in this area. So this has been tried in other areas, for example, when it comes to what's being called orphan drugs, for instance. So drugs for diseases that are very rare, so it's very difficult to do good research to prove that they are effective. So then you could cut the red tape and say that, okay, but we will accept the drugs anyway, because it would be unjust to these people who have very rare diseases, because otherwise we won't have any drugs at all for them. So that has been the sort of logic in these kinds of argument. So this has been proposed also in this area. So it could regard safety, it could be about ethical requirements on the way you set up research trials and all kinds of different kinds of ideas there. The problem is, of course, that the tape is there for a reason. Now I took some pictures to illustrate the ethical tape, but I could have, for example, a lot of pictures here about deformed children because of, under-researched drugs that sort of harmed people. So here, of course, you have the freezing experiments, and you have the Swedish Vipeholm project, where you had intellectually disabled people undergoing forcible dental research to prove that eating candy is bad for you in the 40s and 50s. And here is from the famous American Tuskegee syphilis study. So will this kind of red tape cutting create a new thing to put here? Because, of course, you can't really, so if you cut the red tapes, if you relax the restrictions on safety, on different kinds of ethical requirements and so on when you develop new drugs, of course this means that you're accepting increased risk, that research subjects are being exploited, and you're also increasing the risk that the project that you introduce into the market for a broader use will be ineffective, or I would say also pose a lot of more risks than before. This is, of course, always on a scale. It's not binary. You will always have risks. So this is more that if you're cutting the red tape, if you're relaxing the requirement, you're increasing these risks. And then you can say, okay, so this would be horrible, of course, you could say, but on the other hand, so if you're not getting this innovation train running, what will happen then? And then, of course, the future patients will stand there with ineffective drugs. So that's the sort of cost that you will have at the other end that is not so visible as the actual patient that would be maybe. So the underlying ethical issue seems to be this one then, that should you accept that present identified concrete patients or research subjects are exposed to increased risk of harm for the sake of future, as yet unidentified, maybe not even yet existing patients. So ensuring the future access to effective drugs by relaxing the red tape, this seems to be the logic of that argument then. And how far would you like to take this? Because, of course, you can take even more red tape down, and you will have a faster innovation procedure, but on the other hand, you will have even more of this increased risk. So this is, of course, a kind of a trade-off or a kind of a balancing of an ethical nature that has to do with present and future, for instance. So that's one of the sort of tensions between traditional medical ethics, because the traditional medical ethics would often say that you can't really sacrifice the present patient before you for some sort of theoretical patient in the future. That's against the typical standard medical ethics. And at the same time, this idea seems to go that way. Right. So the next strategy is this idea of controlling antibiotic consumption then, and this mostly means in countries like ours, where we have mandatory prescription, So in order to get your hands on an antibiotics, you need to go to a doctor. The doctor needs to diagnose you with something so that prescribing an antibiotic is appropriate, and then you get your hands on the antibiotic. So, and in a society like that, so what you then want to do is that you want to restrict the prescription practice, basically. So you want a doctor, so you want to increase the bar for when it's okay for a doctor to prescribe an antibiotic. It could even be, for the most precious antibiotics, this last resort, that you're actually taking away the prescription privilege altogether from an ordinary GP to an ordinary sort of family doctor. In order to prescribe the last resort antibiotics, the family doctor has to ask for permission from some committee or something. So this is actually being done a little bit in some Swedish counties on experimental to see how that works. In order, and that's of course on purpose to ration the use of these last resort antibiotics then. Well, in some countries, a lot of countries actually around the globe, there is no mandatory prescription institution. You can just go to the chemist and buy whatever you want to have. And then, of course, the first step would be then to install some kind of prescription institution then, in that case. And here's a new thing that's been coming up, that people buy drugs online. So you have this kind of offshore market. That's of course, and then of course, the more you have restrictions here, probably you increase the space for the offshore markets, and then you can discuss regulation and so on. And one thing that's very clear in this area, so one part of this is very, very easy from a medical ethical perspective, because all unnecessary use of drugs is actually, you know, exposing patients to unnecessary risk. So you shouldn't use it. So you shouldn't really prescribe an antibiotics just to be sure, or just because the patient wants to be safe to go on a holiday or something like that. And one of the things that you do, and this is pretty recent, is that, so if I take an antibiotic when I'm not infected, this means that this antibiotic, the way antibiotic use is that this antibiotic will kill off my natural gut bacteria, and the only bacteria that will be able to live in my body are the resistant bacteria. So I'm now actually invited resistant infection into my body. So if you go, maybe you have done this sometimes, you go on a holiday and you take an antibiotic cure for prophylactic purposes. You don't have this is what you do, you're inviting the resistant infection. So it's very easy from a medical ethical perspective to say that this kind of prescription is actually against medical ethics. You're exposing people to unnecessary harm. There is no medical reason for this. And this is kind of easy then. And also from a societal perspective, of course, all kind of uncontrolled drug consumption is a public health hazard. Because all drugs sort of, well, they put a strain on the body in various ways, and if you consume it in an uncontrolled way, it's a health hazard. So that's one part of it. But it's also the case that even if you don't see a good medical reason to prescribe the antibiotic, the patient may have a very good reason of their own. So here's one that we've been talking about a lot, is that the interest that you have to have an antibiotic prescribed is often that you want to get well quicker. Right? So you want to get, why do you want to get well quicker? Well, here's one reason. You want your child to get well quicker in order to be able to put it back into daycare, in order to be able to return to work. Or if you yourself have an illness, you want to be able to return to work. Well, in society that we have more and more unsecure employment. So I have a very secure employment. For me, this is no problem. So the only thing can happen to me is that my academic status goes down a little bit if I have a prolonged sick leave, because I don't publish so many articles, blah, blah, blah. I can live with that. I will keep my employment, I will have my salary. But a lot of people today, even in rich countries like Germany and Sweden and most of the European countries, have unsecure employment. So even just a few days away from job places you in jeopardy to lose your income. So of course the more you have that kind of things, or that you have, most people have, so even if you have a health insurance that will compensate you when you're on sick leave, it will not compensate you for 100%, of course. So I get 80%, I think, when I'm on sick leave back. All right, I can manage on that, at least for a few months even. But if you have a lower salary, so that your life is, you're just barely making it work, your life, just barely able to pay the rent and have the cheapest kind of food, even the smallest reduction of your income can be a catastrophe for you. So this means that the way that we sort of organize our societies may heavily impact what is in the best interest of a patient here. So even if there is no medical reason to prescribe this antibiotic, if you're home 1 week more and drink plenty of water and keep warm, the infection will go away, no problem. This is true of most of the infections that we are stricken with. But for a person in this kind of situation, it's not only that, it's also keeping your income and being able to support your children and things like that. So here we see that you can't really separate here the idea of what's the best interest of the patient from the way that we contextualize healthcare in a society. And you can't really get away from, so if you restrict especially the most precious antibiotics, this will necessarily mean that you have to accept higher risk of patient harm. So we had Michael Miller, who is a British doctor. He talked at this symposium and he took some examples of pediatrics, when you have very, very sensitive pediatric patients, and you have to give them antibiotics. And then you have some children who have very, very serious diseases, so they get the first pick of the antibiotic. And then you have the almost as serious infection, they get the second pick. Then you have the almost as serious as that, they get the third pick. Some way down this list, you will have to draw the line. You can't escape that logic. So if you ration the use of antibiotics, some patient groups, although they are sick, you will say, well, if I have the choice to give you or you the drug, I have to give it to you, and you have to deny you, not because it's good for you, but because of the interest of society or public health or the future access to antibiotic. And this seems to be an inescapable thing then. So how, and this is clearly a tension with this standard way of thinking about medical ethics, that I, as a doctor, am supposed to think about what's the best interest of my patient before me, right, when I do my actions. Right, so the third thing, this is about controlling not the consumption but the actual resistant infections then. So what I often mean here is that the idea is that we should have some kind of screening programs. So we have this, and so I will tell you, in Sweden we have these mandatory screening programs now. So I'm obliged as a citizen, if I enter a hospital, I will be given this form, and then I have to cross this box if I have been abroad the last 6 months. This is considered to be a risk factor, to be a carrier of resistant bacterial culture. Being a carrier and being infected are two different things. So I'm a higher risk of carrying a resistant strain, right? Most of the people who carry resistant strain never have any resistant infections. So it's not really good for me to be tracked in this way. It's something that's done in the interest of society and public health. Then you can screen some kind of number of patients for resistant actual infections, of course, in order to quickly take different kinds of action to combat the spread of the resistant infections. And you can also do this with regard to the cultures. There's a number of actions here. All of them are sort of restrictive intervention. So you decide that when you have some kind of result from this screening, you will take some kind of restriction action. What can the action be? Well, you could restrict access to hospitals, for instance. And this, of course, means that as a patient, I have less of a chance of getting special medical help compared to other people. Classic actions in infectious disease, of course, isolation, quarantine, these kinds of things, being confined to my home, maybe. I could get orders to restrict my lifestyle in various ways. I could think that I have to report to the health authorities regularly so that they take a lot of tests and see how I'm doing. All kinds of things that you can, and all of these things these are not new things. These are done in infectious disease situation when you have serious epidemic situations or pandemic situations in order to try to contain these epidemics. But of course, you do the action towards individuals, but it's not necessarily in the interests of these individuals. It's in the interest of the wider society and public health that you do it. So here you can have classic kind of conflicts coming, and you have these well-known risks of screening. This is something I worked on quite a bit. So already when you try to start to screen people, when you start to investigate them, you will create a lot of fear. Just by that, just by asking people a question. Especially if it's a hospital or a doctor asking the question, then of course the natural thought is, what's wrong with me? Or the other way, if you have a sense of giving sort of the right answer to the question, you create a sense of false security. So people will not seek the help it would be best that they would seek. They will not contact healthcare because they think, oh, it's not a matter for me, it's no worry for me. It's these other people who get these resistant infections. It's not me, and so on. This is also a well-known side effect of screening programs that you create. Stigmatization means that you create a psychological phenomenon just by asking people questions or having certain, so you have people who carry, this is already being researched actually, so that carry resistant bacteria, but they think they are infected. Because it's very, difficult to explain the distinction. And it's very difficult for most people to understand the concept of carrying a health risk that is not a concrete thing. Most people have a very difficult time dealing with this. What does it mean? Everybody who has some mathematical statistics know what risk means in this concept, right? It's not about you. It's about this population where you happen to be a part. It's basically that. But for most people, haven't really read any mathematical statistics. So, and then, of course, you have the social reaction to stigma. So in the neighborhood, the knowledge gets around. So I happened to mention to my neighbor, well, I was screened in the hospital, and I told me I'm not increased risk because I was, taking this holiday in the Canary Islands. Oh my God, and the talk gets around in the village, and at the end of the day, the other parents don't want to have my children in daycare. Classic example, right? So these kinds of things happen all the time. And then, of course, you can also have social discrimination in the workplace and so on. That people are being, and of course there's also a well-known thing we know from history that when you have these kinds of restrictive actions taken in an infectious disease context, they tend to become more restrictive and more brutal than they have to be. Why? Because the people who are working professionally with enacting these actions, they are just people. So we already have studies of this. We had a case of carbapenem resistance in Gothenburg, for instance. And no, not carbapenem, sorry, another very serious resistance. So not the carbapenem, sorry, that was the wrong thing. But very serious, and these persons were kept in isolation for many, many, many months. The whole hullabaloo, this thing, basically. So complete isolation. And this, of course, is psychologically damaging to that person. But the interesting thing was that researchers were also interviewing the staff. And the staff, they were very clearly, very quickly objectifying this person. So they were viewing this not as a patient. They were viewing this as a dangerous object. And the sort of standard instinct that you will find in the medical profession to help very quickly disappeared. It was more about, they were more worried about themselves than they were about the patients, because of the seriousness of this infection. So you have all these kinds of things that happen when you have programs like this. And this is well known. And of course, this is sort of also attention to traditional medical ethics. But on the other hand, is it really... So then you can also, is it defensible to expose people to these kinds of risk of being discriminated or stigmatized or being lured into false beliefs or whatever it is? I mean, we're not in the stage of an acute public health threat here. We're trying to contain something that may become dangerous down the line. So it's not this acute nature, it's a slowly emerging disaster. A colleague of mine, Jasper Littman, who works at the Robert Koch Institute here in Germany actually, has termed it. So it's not a normal type of disaster where everything happens at once, it's slowly emerging step by step. And the only way to create it is, of course, to control this slow process. And there's also this, and this is an extra thing on top of it, because if people find these kinds of restrictions or monitoring programs too intrusive, you risk also to have a backlash against the policies. So one thing that could happen is, for example, that people become less happy with seeking medical help. Because if they do, they know they will be monitored and at risk of these kinds of restrictive conditions. Right. So here's some general concerns that I've been thinking about here. So from the point of view of medical ethics, so there's a tension here. It can be discussed, I think, how grave the conflict is between these public health concerns and the sort of professional medical ethical concerns. But so if we but assume that the conflict is rather serious, then you can ask, well, should we change medical ethics somehow? The standard professional medical ethics. One way of arguing for that, and I have some colleagues that have been sort of talking a little bit about that, would be to say that, well, hey, if we have a professional medical ethics, which in this situation seems to mean that is, if we keep to it, we will completely undermine our future ability to do good with the practice of medicine. What's the point of this medical ethics? It's not really doing its job. And that's a way of looking at medical ethics as a kind of institution that's there for a reason, right? So this is not the way a moral philosopher often thinks about medical ethics as something that's an applied moral philosophical thing. This is of thinking as medical ethics as an institution that we have for something. Well, I think this is a sort of an interesting question, but it also, how interesting it is, I think, depends on how serious this conflict or these tensions really are. So that remains to be seen, I think. But if we want to change professional medical ethics, how could we do it? Could we do it to accommodate these implications from what seems to be necessary to fight antibiotic resistance? Well, in a way, I mean, medical ethics has been dealing with this conflict between individual health concerns and public health concerns always. We always had some kind of a little bit of trade-off and sliding. So we have these offices where we actually have medical doctors working with containing epidemics, for instance. And they are discharging these kinds of more restrictive things. We have health surveillance of populations. We're collecting statistics, You have these kinds of things. We have different kinds of structures in place. We have chosen to have the red tape of drug development at this height rather than this height. We could have made it even more restrictive than it is now if we had wanted to. We choose to have it that, so maybe we could take it down a little bit. So this is kind of but what's really interesting in this case, I think, is that what happens here is that this sort of tension between thinking in population terms of health and thinking in individual terms about health is moving sort of inside healthcare, the sort of standard place of healthcare, a hospital, a GP center, you know, when you have your consultation with your family doctor. Normally, that takes place without any kind of concerns around public health ethics. But here, this concerns moves into your pen when you're writing the prescription as a doctor. And this seems to be radicalize the situation a little bit compared to before then. On the other hand, it's also the case that also from a public health standpoint, it's pretty important that the medical profession and the institution of healthcare can preserve this trust that the medical ethics, the standard medical ethics, is there to protect a little bit. So I'll close off with some of the, so this is work in progress at the moment, so these are some tacit conclusions I'm playing with at the moment myself. So one idea connects to a former speaker that you had recently here, Angus Dawson. We tend to often, me and Angus think in similar, this is the idea to think that this is a way of understanding the antibiotic resistance challenge as a sustainability problem. So what's the problem with antibiotic resistance? It's that it threatens to undermine something which is a resource or a capacity that we want to preserve. In this way, we can talk about it in terms of sustainability. So if we consume too much antibiotics in the wrong way, at least, then we're undermining this capacity to fight disease in the future as well as problem. So maybe one way would be then to add to the standard clinical medical ethics some idea of this kind, to say that, well, we have the standard ideas that I told before, but we add this idea that what you do to help a patient must never be something that if you generalize it to all patients, and of course you should treat all patients according to the same principles, then that would become unsustainable. So if I prescribe antibiotics to people just because they want to go on a holiday and just to be sure, if I do that to everyone who asked for it, and if every doctor does this, you have generalized a practice that seems to be unsustainable. And one way, of course, if you're thinking like a philosopher, to try to back that up would be to say that, well, hey, this is actually just to universalize the principles that we already have here in the professional ethics. So you just say that, well, you universalize this medical ethical ethos across generations. So you think about the future hypothetical patients as actual concrete people. So just as you wouldn't sort of kill one of the patients in your waiting room to take the organs and give to the other patient in your waiting rooms, you're not going to do something with your patient here in your waiting room that would harm a future patient in the future by taking away an option that would otherwise be there. So this is one way of trying to back that up with some kind of moral philosophical argument. Here's another way of thinking about it, and it's to think that, well, actually what you do, so there's this famous argument against strict egalitarianism. I'm sure some of you know, for instance, the leveling down argument, right? So if the only thing you think about is equality, you should be just as happy when everyone has nothing as when everyone has everything. It's the only thing that matters is equality. But the problem is that most people would say that there's some kind of moral difference between these two, right? So if you can move to a thing where nearly everyone have everything and a few people have almost everything, the only way to have the perfect equality would be to take away everything for everyone. that's the way to go if you're this kind of rigid egalitarianism, right? Well, here you have to have something similar happening. So if you're keeping to these standard medical ethical principles, also in a context where this creates this kind of collective action problem, that you're actually undermining the resource that all of you uses by keeping to the rules that you usually keep to, then you have, could be described in many ways, but some kind of irrationality happening on a collective scale. So what do you do that? Well, then you can change the rules that you follow so that you avoid the collective action problem. And what you would have to do then would be to do it in order not then to undermine your future ability of doing good. But this doesn't really, so this is very theoretical, doesn't really answer what to do concretely. So one thing that's been discussed very much, well, do we want the actual doctors and the actual nurses in hospitals or in primary care clinics to think about these things? So this is a question that comes up usually when you talk about priority setting, when you talk about distributing money for healthcare resources. So a much repeated argument is that we have to priority set, we have to decide where to put the money in healthcare resources, but we don't want the medical doctors to do that in the clinic. We want to have these decisions already made at some other level of the institution. And this is maybe something that you, and why? Well, because most of us wouldn't feel very secure as patients if we knew that when I meet the doctor, one of the things the doctor thinks about is how much I cost. We want to have doctors that think only about what I need as a patient. And then maybe some people in the committee on a higher institutional level have thought about how people like me cost, of course. This has to be done in any sort of economic system, of course. But we don't want the doctors to do that. So maybe we should think about a similar way here, that whatever they do to maintain the sustainability of the health systems in the face of the antibiotic resistance challenge, we will try to have it enacted at other institutional levels. But it will have to make, I think it's necessary to have still the health professionals will have to accept that this happens. So this is a bit of an accommodation, still from the traditional medical ethical stance. And this is actually, it's very interesting, it's being quite widely debated among medical professionals in different fields, and different people react very differently to these kinds of things. So I love to hear your reactions now. Thank you.